1995 Intel World Chess Championship took place at the top of the world, as New Yorkers like to call the observation deck of the World Trade Center. The players would contest the match in a specially constructed soundproof booth, a goldfish bowl for the world's media to gawp into. Although Garry Kasparov had been at the top of the chess world for 10 years, many people felt that his time had come. At 32, he no longer looked invincible. The years of pressure and tension were taking their toll. His challenger was Viswanathan Anand from India. At 25, Vishy looked young, fit and motivated. With his fast and fluent style, he'd cut a swathe through the world's best players to reach this final. On the other hand, Kasparov's last tough World Championship match had been 5 years ago against Karpov. His match in 1993 against Short hadn't really stretched him, so no one could predict how he was going to play here. Earlier this year, the players met in the Kremlin in the first leg of the Intel Grand Prix, where Anand slaughtered Kasparov at speed chess.
And Kasparov has resigned. Oh, what a powerful performance by Anand. Totally outplaying an esteemed opponent. A very impressive victory. Kasparov must be disgusted.
But would the world's fastest player be crowned the world's best player?
He's a good player, you know, and I have to admit that this player is much more solid and more stable than Nigel Short in 1993. And I think it will be a very tough challenge.
Well, we both basically agreed with each other. We didn't have a clue what was going on. So. Basically. I don't know. I mean, well, I think the spectators had enough fun. I mean, when I played Queen takes B3, I could hear this guy, you know, in Madras. So I mean, it was just well, I stepped out and I could hear.
Was another draw.
Them,
it seemed as though Kasparov had the measure of Anand's strategy against the Sicilian.
You know, again, it's too much at stake, and I mean, you can't blame, you know, opponents for avoiding additional risk. And in fact, you know, again, except Game 6, I mean, all other positions you could go and play. You know, there are many players that would, you know, play forever the final position of Game 7, for instance. Yeah, but again, it's roughly equal. That's why what you can expect, you know, from the opponents if they just don't want to continue the position, which has very little.
I mean, a win is nice, whether it comes after 8 draws or it comes immediately or whenever, and it's just good. I mean, nothing more than that. It's still the match still goes on, but hey, I'm happy.
After 9 games, the world champion Garry Kasparov found himself 1 point down to the Indian challenger Vishy Anand. Clearly, this was a situation that Kasparov did not enjoy. When he appeared for Game 10, he was so pumped up, it was frightening. Gone was that warm greeting with Anand at the start of the games. Here, it was chilly. He didn't make any eye contact with Anand at all. Kasparov once again opened with pawn to e4, and Anand repeated the open Spanish variation that he'd played in Game 6. And Kasparov again played this amazing piece sacrifice, knight to g5. His position in Game 6 wasn't that great out of the opening, so he had clearly had something prepared for this game. Anand captured on c3, all as in Game 6. Kasparov captured the bishop on e6, Anand recaptured. Pawn takes c3, and now queen to d3, and it was here that Kasparov played the new move. He played bishop to c2, so he's retaining this dangerous bishop. This bishop is the key to this game, very powerful attacking piece. So he's sacrificing a pawn, and then came this amazing move, knight to b3, sacrificing a whole rook. Apparently, bishop c2 had been a suggestion of Mikhail Tal's, and Anand's team knew of this move, bishop c2, but they'd failed to spot this idea, knight b3, sacrificing the rook. Anand captured the knight on b3, Kasparov recaptured with bishop takes b3, and here if black wants to, he can take the rook. Well, in fact, Anand didn't take that rook immediately. Let's just take a look at a few variations to see what happens if he does play queen takes rook in the corner. Kasparov said after the game it was his intention to play queen to h5 check. Now this is a very crafty move indeed. So black can either play g6 or move his king. Well, if he plays the king up to e7, then comes bishop g5 check, and then the rook on f1 on the next move will take the queen on a1. So king e7 is out of the question. The same would happen on king d8, and so that leaves king d7. And here there's a beautiful variation. Bishop takes pawn check, king takes bishop, queen g4 check, and now black's king can dance all over the place, but it always gets caught. For instance, king to f7, queen f3 check. That is a very cunning move, because now if king g8, then we have queen d5 checkmate. So king e6, queen takes knight check. You see what a problem for black it is once that pawn has moved to b5. And it meant that the knight on c6 is unprotected, and you'll see in many variations that that knight on c6 is hanging. So now bishop d6. So at least the rook on a8 is now covered by the rook on h8. However, white is winning back all this material, and it's a very simple win now. Pawn takes bishop. Well, there's just one move which is difficult for white. It seems as though black might be able to defend after a move like queen e5. But here there's a very nice winning move. White plays bishop d2. This is much better than any discovered checks with the pawn. Bishop d2 threatening the simple rook e1. And there's absolutely no defence to white's attack here. Instead of moving the king, black can play pawn to g6, and then the queen drops back to f3. Well, I mean, you might say, what's the point of checking? Why didn't white move the queen to f3 straight away? Well, here's the very clever point. Black has big problems defending the knight on c6. In fact, it's pretty impossible. So black has to either give up the knight or move it away and give up the rook. Well, let's have a look at a move like castle's queenside. But then comes queen takes knight, and black's king has found no security here on the queen side either. For instance, queen takes pawn, and then comes queen takes pawn check, a deadly move. If king b8, then there's bishop to e3, threatening bishop to a7 check, and if c5, then queen b6 check is going to be decisive. And if bishop c5, then queen b5 check wins. Alternatively, if king to d7, then there's a rather beautiful winning move for white here. Bishop f4. And if the queen takes the bishop, then queen takes pawn on e6 is checkmate. If black plays the knight back to d8, now we see the crafty point of forcing the pawn to g6 before moving the queen to f3. If queen takes rook in the corner, then it seems that black can survive by playing queen takes pawn, followed by bishop d6, and then castling on the king side. Although black has returned the rook, his king at least would have found some security, and he would still be a pawn up. However, instead of capturing the rook, white plays queen to f6. Now we see the point of forcing the pawn up to g6. This is decisive. If rook g8, then bishop g5. So the rook on f1 now attacking the queen. And when the queen comes back into the centre, then rook d1, and that's decisive. If the queen moves, then the knight on d8 is hanging, so black must give up the queen. Bishop takes queen, and in this position white has the queen against the two rooks. Well, normally this is a reasonable material balance for the rooks, but here, because of the power of the two bishops and the fact that black's king is stuck in the middle of the board and really can't find any security at all, white has a winning position. It's because of the loose nature of black's position, in particular that knight on c6, which is very often hanging in many variations, and the king, which is really quite exposed in the middle of the board, that black can't get away with taking the rook. Instead, Anand played the knight into d4, hoping to exchange off this powerful attacking piece on b3, the bishop. And here, Kasparov played queen to g4, and Kasparov was amazing. Kasparov was playing his moves absolutely instantly, banging out his moves and then retreating back to his dressing room. He was storming out of the soundproof booth each time, slamming the door. I mean, he looked like a raging bull. It was an amazing performance. Anand's position is really creaking now. There's a threat to capture the pawn on e6, so he thought he may as well grab the rook in the corner now. So then came bishop takes pawn on e6 and rook d8. And the clock times at this point showed that Kasparov had used about 4 minutes, while Anand had taken well over an hour. And the 4 minutes that Kasparov had used were really the time he'd spent running in and out of the soundproof booth. And now the world champion played a shocking move. Bishop to h6. Tremendous shot. So that now, if queen takes rook, king takes queen, pawn takes bishop, queen h5 check, king e7, queen f7 is checkmate. Anand is forced to move the queen back, but then Kasparov crashed through. Bishop takes g7. Anand finds the only move to keep in the game, queen d3, bring his queen back to defend against the check on h5. So Kasparov just bagged the rook in the corner and the queen dropped back to g6. Well, this was the first moment that Kasparov stopped to think in the game. He took off his wristwatch and placed it by his score sheet, a familiar habit of his indicating that he's about to get down to business. His home preparation must have ended round about here with the conclusion that white has an extra pawn, 2 bishops, he must be winning. Kasparov played his bishop to f6, then came bishop e7, then bishop takes bishop on e7, queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, king takes e7. And in this position, Kasparov has a rook and a bishop against a rook and a knight, and he's a clear pawn up, and it's those pawns on the king side that eventually marched down the board, and with some nice technique from Kasparov, he polished off the game. This was a spectacular performance from the world champion, but as Kasparov admitted after the game, it had all been home preparation. He said, "I spent 2 minutes during the game over the first 20 moves, but 48 hours beforehand."
This game helps me to restore the confidence, but I still have to solve many problems. I'm vicious, well prepared, and it's not easy to invent all ideas like that in every game.
A shock awaited Anand at the start of game 11. Kasparov played his standard Sicilian defense. Pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. And here, instead of playing the Najdorf Variation, Kasparov, for the first time in his life, played the dragon. Well, I mean, this was such a shocker. I don't think anyone could have predicted this variation. It must have been unnerving for Anand. He'd had the rest day to try and pick himself up and to prepare for another tough battle, and here he was faced with the dragon variation, a frighteningly complicated opening, in which one false move could spell disaster. After 5 minutes, he played bishop e3, bishop g7, f3. Now, Anand thought for some time before playing this Yugoslav attack, which is really the sharpest response to the dragon. Kasparov castled, came queen d2, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop d7, castles, queenside. So here we have the normal starting position of the Yugoslav attack. Black tries to gain counterplay down the open c file, while white is looking to open the h file by advancing his h-pawn. So they came knight e5, attacking the bishop, which retreated, and rook to c8 and h4. This has been seen many, many times before. And here, in the Intel Speed Chess tournament in Moscow earlier in the year, Anand had had exactly this position against Alexander Halifman, who now played the knight to c4. Anand captured, of course, rook takes c4, and continued trundling the h-pawn down the board, which was taken. But it's all normal though, because now white has opened the h-file, and Vijay played king b1. Well, Anand actually went on to win a really good game, but Kasparov chooses to play more solidly than this. Instead of playing the knight into c4 immediately, he blocked the h-pawn with pawn to h5. This is known as the best way to play the dragon variation for black. Anand played the king to b1, and then came knight to c4. Bishop takes, rook takes. And now a retreat from Anand. He played the knight back to e2. The point of this is that he wants to play the bishop to h6. But of course, with the knight on d4 immediately, then bishop h6 would simply lose material to rook takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop takes bishop. Anand has played in this way before, though it's not really the sharpest treatment of the variation. So psychologically, I think Kasparov's opening had already succeeded. As the world champion said after the game, I felt that Anand was not ready for a big shock today. After the loss on Tuesday, it was difficult for him to play very sharply against the dragon. Kasparov continued with his play on the queen side. Played pawn to b5, so that now he's preparing to push on with b4 and open up the c file. Then came bishop to h6. And now Kasparov played a very strong move. b4 immediately has been played in this position, but after bishop takes g7, king takes bishop, knight d5, knight takes d5, pawn takes knight, queen a5, b3, rook c5, g4, white stands better. This was played in the game Patrick Wolf against Kirill Georgiev, Biel in 1993. And remember, Patrick Wolf is one of Anand's seconds. So Anand would definitely have known about this game, although, as Kasparov shows, he hadn't actually looked at the position very deeply. It took Kasparov just 2 minutes to play the queen to a5. Now this is a really strong improvement over b4. And it shows just how accurately he managed to predict Anand's response to the dragon variation. Very often black's unprotected queen on a5 is a tactical liability, but here the old knight d5 trick in the dragon rebounds on white. For instance, after knight d5, queen takes d2. Now this is very often the point of playing the king to b1, so that after the exchange on d2 it's no longer check, so that white has time to play this Zwischenzug, an in-between move, knight takes pawn check, king h7, so now the bishop recaptures the queen. But here, black wins the piece with rook to e8. If the knight retreats to d5, then knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and the knight on e2 is hanging. With this move, queen to a5, Kasparov demonstrates that white's plan is simply too slow, and that his queenside counterplay is very fast indeed. So Anand was actually forced to simplify in this position. So bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and now knight to f4. Kasparov continues building up on the queenside with rook f to c8. Now black's pressure on the c file is very powerful. The threat is to play b4 to open up the c file and come in on c2. So Anand is forced to simplify, forced to offer an exchange of queens here with knight to d5. Kasparov captured on d2, and at this moment he offered Anand a draw, which was reasonable considering that position is roughly equal. But it was also reasonable for Anand to decline the draw offer, because he can still play a little bit in this position. He has a slight central space advantage. So after 4 minutes thought, he played rook takes d2. I think Anand was just trying to play himself back into the match after this defeat in game 10. So I think it was reasonable he declined the draw, even though he doesn't really have much advantage here. Then came knight takes knight on d5. White recaptured the knight on d5, and the king dropped back to f8 to defend the pawn on e7. The rook came across to e1. And then came rook b8, which is a slightly strange move. I think that Anand does have a little bit of initiative here, a little bit of pressure. That knight on d5 is slightly awkward for black, although black doesn't really have any weaknesses here, so it should be okay for black. b3, attacking the rook, which dropped back to c5. Then knight f4. Rook bc8, there we go, the rooks are simply moved back again to the c file. King b2, a5, a3, now king g7, and knight d5. Well, of course, Kasparov could retreat the king back to f8, but instead he sets a cunning little trap. He played bishop to e6, which Vichy fell straight into. Here, Anand could play knight takes pawn on e7. But then rook e8. Now we've got a similar trick to the variation I pointed out earlier. If knight d5, then black has bishop takes knight, and there's the pin on the e file. So white can't recapture immediately, but he can play pawn to b4, which saves the piece. Now after pawn takes pawn, rook c4. It's a forced variation, this. Rook takes bishop. And now if black plays rook takes pawn check, king back to c1, and then f5, the position will probably simplify down to a draw. This is probably best play for both sides, but instead Anand thought that he could win material. He played pawn to b4, after pawn takes pawn, rook c4. He played knight b6 after just 1 minute's thought. So the knight forks both rooks, but unfortunately after rook takes pawn check, which of course Anand had seen, then came king to a3. Both rooks are attacked, but Kasparov has the dynamic sacrifice rook takes pawn on c2. So obviously if king takes rook on b4, then rook takes d2, and black is simply 2 pawns up with a winning endgame. And if rook takes rook, then rook b3 check. King has just one move, king to a2. And then comes rook e3 check, discovered check from the bishop on e6. King moves, and then rook takes rook. And again, Black is 2 pawns up with a simple winning endgame. Anand resigned after rook takes c2. In the past, Anand has been prone to making these one-move blunders because of the speed of his play, but in the last couple of years he's slowed right down, and we thought he'd remedied this problem. Psychologically, this was a crushing blow for the Indian. John Fedorowicz, New York Grandmaster, said afterwards, "I know Vishy doesn't drink, but this is a great day to start." After the dramatic events in the last 3 games, both players looked completely punch-drunk for Game 12. It ended in a draw after Kasparov had some advantage but didn't have the energy to finish off Anand.